Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us so far. We'll just wait a moment or so before we do get started. There's just a couple more people in the waiting room filing in. Very good. All right, we might make a start. Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today for our free partner webinar to be delivered by Komodo. Before we do start, something a little bit left field. We're currently here at ABSA having issues with our domain, so we're not receiving any emails and our website is down. If anyone is wondering what's going on, that's the reason. It's been occurring since about 7:30 a.m. yesterday. We currently have the right people on the job, and we hope that that'll be sorted in no time. So thank you all for your patience there with that, if anyone is trying to contact us at ABSA. Some housekeeping for our webinar today. Any comments that you might have throughout the session, please feel free to pop them into the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Any questions that you have, feel free to use the questions tab to its left. I'll be facilitating a Q&A with our presenter at the end of today's webinar. Komodo have been a very valued partner of ABSA for a number of years now and have delivered a number of webinars for us, with all of them being extremely informative and very well received by our community. Today we're here to discuss making the unfamiliar familiar and how to manage homesickness. We're very fortunate to have child and family psychologist and lead psychologist at Komodo, Ilia Lindsay, with us, who will be presenting on this topic. So Ilia, we welcome you. Thank you for joining us, and I'll hand straight over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jared. And thanks everyone for taking the time to join me this morning, or whether you're watching the recording later on. As Jared said, making the unfamiliar familiar. Homesickness is something every boarding school is going to manage. It doesn't matter how good our processes are, how good our initiatives are. This is something we need to accept that most students are going to go through at some point. So I'm hoping today that we'll get through some practical strategies, as well as giving you a little bit more insight and context to where homesickness stems from and why it presents the way that it does. So for a lot of our students, moving to boarding school is the first time they move away from home for a long period. And so there's this excitement of independence and autonomy, but then there's also this very anxiety-provoking space of being in a really unfamiliar environment that sometimes is across state lines and is the first time that they've been out of their home state, or for some of our students is across international lines. So just, I suppose, before we continue any further, when I'm talking homesickness, I'm talking about this intense longing to be home. It's this almost intrusive thought pattern that students have, where they are essentially often comparing their current boarding school environment to what they had at home. So whenever you hear me talk about homesickness, this is the kind of phrase or meaning behind what I'm talking about. So let's have a look at what we'll quickly cover today. So we're lucky enough that we do have some very local context with our Australian-based research. So we'll actually look at what this looks like specifically in our Australian-based boarding schools. We're going to talk a little bit about what causes homesickness, because that also helps guide our interventions. We're then going to talk about when to intervene, because like I said, this is a very normal experience for students. So there's a bit of a balance between helping a student through it and acceptance, and there are definitely going to be other students who need a bit more wraparound support. So we're going to talk about how to notice the difference between those two. And then lastly, we get to the good stuff. We're going to hopefully cover some practical ideas and strategies that you can use, you know, within the next term, within the next week. Use them straight away with your students as ways of both preventing homesickness and intervening in managing the severity of homesickness, I suppose. So if we have a look first at, we are lucky enough, thank you ABSA, that we have some ABSA-based research that has collated what is going on in our Australian boarding schools. And then we've had some more local research being done off the back of it. So what we know is that Australian boarding schools is an eclectic bunch of students. We know that there's a variety of backgrounds living in these boarding houses. We've got different ethnicities, cultures, languages, religion, and socioeconomic status as well. So we are dealing with a mini global community within each of our boarding schools typically. As I said at the start, often this is the first time that students are living away from home. And what's interesting is we actually have research that boarders do experience greater emotional difficulties. So more specifically, we've actually got an Australian-based study that had a look at the students that transitioned across grade 7 to grade 9. And the results showed that all boarding students in that catchment experienced higher emotional symptoms and difficulties when compared to the day students in the same school. But what the study also showed is that this vulnerability or complexity and severity of emotional difficulties was much greater in the first year of transition to boarding school. So it wasn't based on age, it was based on how many years have you been at boarding school was the mitigating factor for how severe or complex the follow-on emotional difficulties were. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this because this is clearly something that we need to focus on. The last point on there, we can't ignore that COVID-19 has also thrown another spanner in the works. We have had students who have not been able to return home for extended periods of time, not being able to travel across states or internationally. Hopefully, as I touch wood as I say this, I hope that we're through the worst of that kind of period of managing student movement. So I'm hoping that we can move forward from there, but we do have to acknowledge that that has definitely played a part of the anxiety and the homesickness that students can experience. So this is the picture. This is what we know. This is what we see is happening in our boarding schools. So what's actually causing homesickness? What's the core? What's sitting underneath it and what keeps it going? So not all homesickness is equal. I continue to say that most students will experience homesickness, but this will be at a different level of severity. It may come at a different time, depending on the root cause or the thing that is maintaining homesickness. So aside from the obvious, missing home, missing family, we can understand a student as experiencing homesickness as having these 4 aspects that you can see on the slide, and I'll come to the environmental one at the end. So the cognitive aspect of what causes homesickness, and I alluded to this a little bit at the start, is the repetitive and almost intrusive in nature thoughts about wanting to be home and comparing your current environment to your old familiar home environment. This is the missing family, wishing you were joining in on what they're doing in the weekend. This is looking on social media and seeing what your friends are doing, what the local community group is doing that you used to be a part of. And it's important that we acknowledge that some of this is normal and it's going to always be a normal experience. But if it's becoming intrusive and it's starting to wind, and you can almost see students switching out from their day-to-day activities or their schoolwork because these thoughts are just peddling constantly in their mind, then this is going to be one of our clues for later on of when we need to intervene. The physiological part of homesickness. So this kind of relates to those thoughts about missing home and missing the new environment, but it's this extra layer of physically what our body feels when we move to a new environment. So this could, well, it often pops up in that initial phase, that initial transition to a boarding school. So these are the difficulty sleeping. This is the change of food, the change of routine, losing your appetite or gaining an appetite, trying to regulate your emotions that way. And when it's the physiological aspects, students tend to recover from this when they're given time, when they're given time to adjust. And if time isn't enough, it's usually practical solutions that help students if homesickness is coming from here. So this is adjusting the sleeping arrangements, it's giving meal options, it's asking for feedback on how they feel the physical environment around them is and how that's affecting them. So we've got cognitive, which is a lot more about this internal process. We've got the physiological cause, which is when my routines, my sleep, my food, when things like that change. The next one we've got here is behavioral. So what I mean by behavioural is what we see a student do or not do. And this is where a student feels almost lost in the new environment. They retreat into themselves. They don't engage in the fun initiatives that are being put in front of them, or they lose interest in activities that they once were kind of putting themselves out for. It's interesting with this one, and we'll come to this in the next part of the webinar, but it's important that when the behavioural component comes into it, we need to increase a student's sense of belonging. We need to help them go towards rather than pulling themselves away and becoming isolated. The last one on there is this emotional aspect of homesickness and what keeps it going. So typically we see this emotional cause of homesickness when the other layers the other areas are starting to layer on top of each other. So we might have a student who is thinking about missing home, or there's an event coming up that they're not going to be at because they're at the boarding school, and they're also not sleeping well because they don't feel comfortable in a busy dormitory that they might be in. And so because they're tired, they've started to stop attending the boarding groups and the activities that are happening after school. And so as these things layer on top, we then get this emotional turmoil that sits on top. I don't want to be here. I just want to be home, this low mood, this anxiety that starts to layer on top. So like I said, as these other areas of homesickness or these other causes of homesickness start to pile up, that's when we often see this emotional phase come in. And we're going to get to it, as I keep saying, next in the kind of intervention prevention phase. But when someone is experiencing that emotional level, that's one of our signs for intervention. When we're noticing that mood drop, that energy drop, that's when we definitely know we need to intervene. So those first four kind of causes or maintaining factors of homesickness, that's what the research tells us. This fifth one on environmental is something that I have added in here because I think it's perhaps the most obvious that boarding houses do not often look like a student's home that they've just come from. So there's this significant change to the immediate environment. The buildings may be bigger. There may be more people around them than what they're used to. The location, where their bedroom is compared to the common areas or the kitchen areas, there's a completely different process compared to how a home may work if you were an only child or only had one other sibling. And I know that a lot of boarding houses will try to replicate a home environment as much as possible, but the reality is this is very different to the way most people are living prior to coming to a boarding house. So the environmental aspect is there. It can end up kids feeling quite irritated, feeling out of control. Everything is just different. And again, this is similar to that physiological one. We see this around that initial transition to a boarding house. And usually with time and time to adjust, this one improves on its own without too much intervention. So, as we keep saying, whilst it's a very normative experience for many students, if they're not supported through this, we know that homesickness, it can essentially fester and get worse and worse. And what we know is the flow-on effects are, as you can see on the slide, we know that school engagement reduces and therefore academic achievement declines. We know that there can often be a pause in that social development. So because it's so difficult to be away from home, I'm not going to put myself out there and I don't feel confident to try and make new friends. So we see this essentially a pause on that social, emotional, developmental stage. Obviously on there, we've also got mental health, which is when we were talking before about when that emotional experience of homesickness comes in. And that's where our boarding students are more at risk of things like depression and anxiety. And again, you can see in bold on the slide, and that comes back to the study that I mentioned earlier, that regardless of age, boarding students who are experiencing homesickness are more vulnerable to developing depression and anxiety. So yes, a normal experience, and we can't just let our students sit and manage this on their own all of the time, because if we do, we're essentially saying, oh, it's okay if you then, if this gets worse and then you end up having depression, anxiety. We don't want that. Yeah, so this is about noticing that regardless of age, regardless of developmental stage, we need to be really proactive in supporting our students so that we don't see these flow-on effects. Trying to change my slide. So perhaps one of the most important parts here is when to intervene. It looks and feels very different to a lot of students, and when you ask students themselves, they'll often describe homesickness as quite a roller coaster of emotions. There might be a slight irritability to start off with, and then there may be anger. There may also be sadness, tearfulness, and distress. So the things that we need to look for essentially are our general mental health kind of screening signs and signals. So the first point on there, obviously, if there's persistent distress, and what we're talking about persistent is this is when homesickness is now getting in the way of schoolwork, of social interactions, of sleep, of your daily tasks. So this is what we mean by persistent. It's everywhere. It's in every context, every environment. Yeah. The next points we have on there are actually what are the behaviours that we need to look for. And if you're familiar with any mental health screening, this list will look very familiar to you. So if we're noticing sudden withdrawal, if we're noticing that flat affect, so the way that they speak, there's kind of no emotion in their face, it's quite incongruent, and it's just a sign of a real flat energy. We've also got in there change of appetite, and this can be a decrease or increase. We know that for some students, as homesickness really sets and sinks its teeth in, their appetite will decrease due to anxiety-based symptoms, or it can increase if a student uses food intake as a way of regulating their emotions. So we're just actually looking for any change in appetite. The next point on there, impulsivity. So this is essentially, the last 2 points kind of go hand in hand. So our window of tolerance. So talking about how many emotions or how bigger the emotions are before we can no longer tolerate them and become distressed. And often what happens is as our window of tolerance gets smaller and smaller, our behaviours become more impulsive. And that's because our behaviours are more emotion driven rather than logic or rationale driven at that point. So when we see risk-taking behaviours, when we see even students trying to do things to get sent home, those kind of things, that's when we need to look at and think we probably need to look at an intervention here. So this brings us to hopefully the gem of the webinar. What do we actually do to either prevent the severity of homesickness, because we know it's kind of inevitable, and also how do we intervene when we need to? So on the first side of things, prevention, the first theme we've got here is building connection. So we know from just general mental health and wellbeing research that connection, whether that's social connectedness, whether that's feeling connection with your family and support networks, any type of human-to-human connection is protective in building resilience. And our research repeatedly shows us that boarding school environments that foster the stable, high-quality, genuine staff-to-student relationship is associated with a much lower experience of homesickness or general student emotional difficulties. So it is so important that the student is able to have time and repeated exposure to their immediate teachers or boarding support staff that are around them. So we often do this part really well at the start of a transition to a boarding house, at the start of the year or even at the start of the term. But what we need to do is we need to continue to facilitate these connections. And as with any relationship, relationships take time and they take touch points. We've got to repeatedly, as I said, expose students to these staff so that they can build that rapport and build that very genuine sense of trust and connection. The other side of it is obviously connecting with your peers. If you feel a sense of social belonging to perhaps the other students that you share a space with, you are going to be, I suppose, that window of tolerance becomes larger. You feel embedded within a system, you don't feel alone. So I don't think I can stress enough the importance of building connections and relationships, and not just at the start of the boarding journey, but the whole way through. I think the important thing to note here is, again, going back to the research, is we know schools do this very well at the start, but there can be students that, in their time away from the boarding school, go through different life changes or developmental changes. So just because a student felt really settled in a boarding house one year doesn't mean that when they come back the following year, they kind of pick up where they left off. We know that so much can change in the adolescent world and in the adolescent brain. So we need to continuously make an effort to spend time building connections with our students. The next point on here is around staff being aware of the developmental changes in adolescence. And this is not just being aware of age and stage and appropriate behaviours, but this is actually being aware of the brain changes that are happening in adolescence. And again, this comes back to research that showed when a cluster of schools were given specific professional development on adolescent brain development and understanding what this then translates to in behaviour, the staff in these schools were better able to identify the students that needed help and were more tolerant, I suppose, to some of the behaviours that were essentially accepted as almost a rite of passage of being in adolescence, the trial and error that comes with the growth of the adolescent brain. The last point on there is around preparation with the family and ongoing family engagement and support. So again, this is something we tend to do really well at the start of a transition. We have families involved, we foster this relationship very closely, and as the school term goes on or as the year goes on, things get busy, and so it can be hard to continually promote this. Now, what we know, thankfully, in a sense, from our COVID-19 research is that students who continued to use things like social media and video calling to stay connected to family were much less likely to experience depression or anxiety symptoms. So for once, social media has been a godsend in this example. And a part of this is perhaps encouraging students to make sure they're reaching out, they're connecting with their family on things like social media or video calls. Okay, so this next side of prevention, we've got building connection, and this one goes hand in hand, and this is about creating belonging. So we know, again, from mental health and general wellbeing research, that if you feel like you are a part of a group, your mental resilience and actually your physical health resilience goes up. So it's crucial that we have a strong orientation process for our students. Similarly to what I said before, it's really important that just because a boarder may have been orientated to the school in the year prior or the term prior, we want to make sure that they're continually given that experience with each year that they return to the boarding house. The other thing around that is noticing when families and other siblings go through a boarding house is we need to make sure that just because they may be familiar with how this works, because they've got a brother or sister that have also been through this environment, we need to make sure that we treat them as their own individual and still give them and the family, again, that same orientation process to building, I suppose, that sense of belonging, particularly as an individual. The next one on here is around creating routine. So we know, again, that boarding school is a very unfamiliar environment for most students. So a way of making things familiar and helping them to integrate is to have a very predictable routine to start off with. It's important that, again, there's a little bit of control given to students around a routine as well. So rather than you must be here at this time, this is the process we follow, it's giving buffer zones. So breakfast is between this time and this time. and prep time is between here and here, and you can either be in this environment or that environment. So there's still structure, there's still routine, and there's a little bit of control being given to the adolescent as well. Because if you think what happens in a home environment is parents probably set some kind of structure and some expectations of what the young person does, but there's also a sense of autonomy and choice. And so we need to make sure that we get the balance of that right when we're creating a routine. Create predictability, but also giving a sense of control and choice in there for the student as well. There's a point on the slide that mentions locus of control. So this is essentially the way we see the world as either things are happening to me and I have no control, or an internal locus of control is I can do things to change the way I am in the world. And it's important just to notice, I suppose, where your students sit on that spectrum. We know that students who feel like they are in control of their environment and can do things to make themselves feel better or to respond are going to do better when it comes to homesickness, rather than the student who feels like everything is out of their control and is just essentially being done to them. So it's more of a personality trait. It's not something you're likely to change too much in your students, but it is something to be aware of, because those students that feel like there's less of control up to them are the ones that are probably more vulnerable to experiencing some type of homesickness. The last point on there is familiarity. So this is familiarity of staff and of environment. Now, COVID has thrown a bit of a spanner in the works with this one, because the research tells us that we need to be around the same people to feel safe and to build those connections. But obviously, with things like COVID, there have been isolation periods, there have been home quarantine periods where we've had to have different staff members coming in and out. That aside, we do need to try and provide that familiarity of staff, so that if something goes wrong, a student knows I can go to this person or this person. That person's familiar to me, I feel safe and I feel protected by them. So familiarity is all about psychological safety. It's about do I feel safe, and do I feel like I have a person I can go to if I don't feel safe. The other point on there is around environment. So this is, again, similar to the orientation and the routine. It's keeping things predictable. Where I sleep is always going to be my room for the next year. It's not going to change term to term. Breakfast, dinner is always served in this room, in this environment. I know my expectations, and I know where I stand. All of these things put together is what helps create the sense of belonging. I am a part of this wider system. And like I said at the start, then protects you and gives you this protective layer or buffer, I suppose, to the effects of homesickness. So if we can't prevent everything, and unfortunately we can't, the other side of the spectrum is intervention. So we've noticed a student is persistently distressed. There's been a significant change in their appetite. They're becoming more and more withdrawn. We need to do something. We need to stop those flow-on effects that we talked about earlier. So how do we do that? First type of intervention we look at is pastoral care. So this is something that is pretty well embedded in most schools now, in fact, which is fantastic. But we need to be a little bit more specific about what pastoral care looks like for homesickness. So we know from the research, as with any other mental health or wellbeing, early intervention is key. As soon as you start to notice this decline, it's putting either a referral in, or it's identifying the student and starting this conversation about what's going on. The second point on here is around CBT, so cognitive behaviour therapy or cognitive behaviour models. As we talked about at the start, there are 4 and possibly 5 if you include the environmental factors that can cause and maintain homesickness. So we need models or therapy frameworks that consider all of those things. And CBT is one of those. So if you have counsellors or specific therapists or professionals attached to your boarding house, it's about making sure they are upskilled in CBT, because this is the therapy that the research tells us is most effective for students that are struggling with homesickness. The next point on there is that we know actually we can target homesickness interventions at either a group level or in an individual intervention. So individual meaning that one-on-one conversation, that one-on-one therapy opportunity, or whatever that may look like. The group intervention, when we talk about group, we're actually talking about small groups, so no more than 8 students. And what this does is a slightly different dynamic, and it's about showing students that they are not alone. There are other students that are struggling with something similar. Now, this isn't going to work for all students, which is why the research says it can be either or. You will definitely have some students who are going to prefer that individualized approach and are going to be able to open up and be a lot more honest about what's going on for them. But you're also going to have some students who are going to be immensely validated by hearing there are other students in their year group or in the year above them that are also experiencing something similar. So it's about knowing your students on that one and knowing who could benefit from which. But the most important message there is the ability to provide both. The last point on there is a peer support network. So a lot of schools we know already do this. So this is essentially a buddy system, mentor groups, having students support students, because who knows the feeling of being away from home better than another boarding school student who has a very similar lived experience. This is something I have put in the intervention because it can be a way of helping a student when they're in that more difficult side, but it also could be seen as a prevention strategy. If this is something that happens as soon as a student comes into a boarding house, they're assigned a buddy or a mentor group or whatever that is called in your school. We could also see this as a way of, again, putting a protective barrier around and protecting them from that more severe experience of homesickness. So the second intervention theme or group of strategies is around providing meaningful activities. Now, this is a strategy that is related to homesickness, but also for low mood in general, which, going by the research, we know boarders experience. So whenever we experience this low mood or this very intense homesickness, our world often becomes smaller and smaller because we have less motivation, we have less energy. So our urge needs to be to guide students in the opposite direction. We need to urge them to go against that feeling of making things smaller and more isolated and actually go towards the meaningful activities. So we're talking about physical activity, being able to walk to school, walking after dinner, or joining something a bit more structured like a sports team. And that could be social or competitive. Things like recreational groups, drama, music, other social clubs. The next point on there is probably my favorite, and that's around prioritizing and actually teaching students about self-care and even scheduling this into the boarding house daily schedule. You know, have you done something to look after yourself today? And anyone that knows anything about self-care knows that this doesn't have to be spending money to do things. This could be taking 5 minutes outside. This self-care activity could be, I called someone back home. You know, it doesn't have to be a big event. This is something that we could weave in and actually encourage students to do on a daily basis. The next point on there is time outside. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the next point around managing that social media and device use. So I've even mentioned it already, but we know that social media and device use can be a way of connecting back to home. So there's a balance here. It's not about completely getting rid of that, but it is about managing, because we know that too much exposure to what's going on at home can also be detrimental. So a way of combating that is having times where social media and devices can be used, but also encouraging time where you need to be outside. Time outside is essential, not just for homesickness, but our general well-being. Vitamin D regulates our melatonin, it regulates our stress hormones. There are so many benefits to half an hour outside. It's going to enable students again, to increase that window of tolerance and being able to regulate their emotions much more effectively. Very simple strategy, which most seasons, hopefully, we can still always manage a little bit of time outside each day. The last point on there is responsibility. So this is giving students, again, a sense of purpose. You need to be ready at this time because you're leading this group to this activity or to this school event or whatever it might be. Often what we do when people are struggling is we want to take things off them to make things easier. But that, again, is an example of your world becoming smaller and smaller. When in fact, we want to do that opposite action, go towards and actually give students responsibilities and things that may actually motivate them to get up and get going again. All right, so this last part is around what can students actually do themselves. Excuse me. So we've looked at what can the school put in place before the student even arrives or as the student's transitioning, those prevention strategies. Then we've looked at intervention. What do you do when you've noticed this student has gone beyond the normal experience of homesickness and what we need to do? So that all relies on the responsibility of school and staff. But there are actually some things that students themselves can do and can be encouraged to do. So the first one up there is probably the most difficult one. So it's actually about normalizing homesickness and helping students to accept and actually just sit with it and be okay. They're allowed to feel homesick. In fact, Jared and I were talking just before this webinar, and we would be worried if students weren't homesick, if students weren't longing to return back to their family. That would almost be a different set of difficulties and perhaps even a bigger red flag than the experience of homesickness itself. Now, I have a wee phrase in there, the jack in the box. So I just want to explain that. So we're talking about sitting with these emotions, feeling uncomfortable about being homesick and not pushing them away. If we pretend like we're okay and watch students kind of fumble and struggle their way through, we can think of this homesickness as a jack in the box. You've tucked it down, but you have no idea when it's going to pop up again. If we open the box, we sit with and we acknowledge that we're feeling homesick, it's there, it's in front of us, and we can manage it. When we push things down, we make things more unpredictable, and we never know when that emotional burst is going to pop up. The other thing that students can do is plan a trip home. Have something to look forward to. This is, again, not something that is limited to homesickness. We all benefit if we know we've got a holiday coming up or if we know we've got a special event coming up. You know, this is well-being research. This is not homesickness. Put something that you're looking forward to in each term and perhaps more frequently if you need that. There's, again, staying connected with friends and family. So this, again, is encouraging that ongoing connection with home. Of course, with the limit. We don't want too much overexposure. And I completely understand that can be a hard line to dance. And I don't have any tips on how to dance that line other than to go with it and to be flexible and adaptable. The next point on there is about creating their space and making it feel like theirs. Bring stuff from home, bring photos, bring books, bring toys, whatever it might be to make their space feel more familiar. Get out and socialize. This again goes back to build connections, create belonging, get out of your room. Again, stay active, which we've already talked about. The next point on there is about gratitude practice. So this can be a student-based initiative, or it could be something that as a school you weave in. So it could be that each day you also, whilst ticking off your self-care activity, have to reflect on 2 things that went really well today. 2 things that you are grateful for about being in a boarding environment, things like that, helping shift the perspective when students may be sitting in that lull of homesickness. The next point on there is about exploring. We can become more familiar with a place if we explore. It goes for moving cities, moving countries. If you get out and explore, things are less scary and they become more familiar. This is about exposure and, again, going towards, so making life bigger rather than making your world smaller. And then the last one there is making sure your students know where they can go for additional help. Is there a specific designated teacher or staff member in their house that they need to go to if they're having bigger issues, or they need someone to talk it through, or wanting more support. So just making sure that students are aware of that, so that they feel like there's some autonomy there, that they can go asking for help as well. So to summarize all of that, the main thing is that we expect homesickness. It's a very, very normal experience, but it can look and feel very different to many of our students. And what makes it look and feel different depends on the factors that sit underneath it. Is it cognitive? Is it behavioral? Is it that physical space? Is it emotional, or is it environmental? Whatever's sitting beneath it, or whatever is maintaining it, is going to perhaps make us second guess and change what the intervention or prevention strategy might be. So it's really important to understand those different factors that can contribute to the homesickness we see. Knowing the signs and the behaviours that show us this is no longer in that normal realm of homesickness. So going back to the slide around that persistent distress, and then a lot of the other general mental health flags and triggers: sleep, appetite, lack of energy, these withdrawal type changes. The last 2 points on there are to make sure that you are weaving these prevention strategies all the way through the year and prior to boarding school starting. So you know that before the next lot of grade 7s or grade 9s are coming in, that this is the process we're going to follow for the first month, and then we've got this next block and this next block. So being really proactive and not just leaving it to the first part of each term or each year. We need to keep this going, because again, we don't even know when homesickness is going to pop up, because it depends on so many different factors. The last point there, plan for intervention. Broken record on this. Most students are going to experience homesickness of some kind. So we need to be prepared, we need to have systems in place, and we need to not only have our staff know how to support students, but use some of those student initiatives and help students understand that homesickness is okay, it is normal. Don't push the jack in the box down, sit with it and try these different things to move that homesickness on. So that brings me to the end of today. As I said, thank you for joining me, and I hope that there has been something you can take from today, whether it's the practical strategies or even just a little bit more contextual information about why homesickness exists the way it does.
Thank you so much, Ollie. That was great, and so much practical advice there for our boarding staff that are listening in today. We have received a couple of questions, and if anyone does have any other questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat box or the questions tab in the bottom right-hand corner there. Ollie, the first question here just says, as we know, there can be specific moments during the year that our boarders are more vulnerable / emotional. Do you have any suggestions for us boarding staff that might assist in picking up on these?
Yeah, I suppose a part of this for me is around, if you know those trends, so perhaps often high stress times, right? So exams, assessments, those kind of high pressure environments will typically make any student more vulnerable, let alone one that's living away from home. So I would encourage you first to make sure you're collecting data so that you know what goes on for your school. You know these kind of pockets of vulnerability throughout the year, and then be proactive on that. So often with stress and exams, and we're just going to use that as the example, sleep quality and quantity of sleep tends to go down. So perhaps that's about identifying that before exam period, we're actually going to do some sleep hygiene education, and we're going to help our boarders to understand how important sleep is for learning, for education performance, etc. like that. So know the pockets is my first piece, but also then be proactive and actually put interventions specifically in place before you get to the hot spots, because if we can learn these things before we need them, we're going to be able to use them. If we're learning this in the middle of the crisis, in the middle of the hotspot, it's too late. It's too difficult to put these things into practice when we're already under stress.
The next question here just says, do you have a favourite saying or response that you like to use for the young ones?
Oh, I like that. I think for me, it comes back to the Jack in the Box. So I actually might explain that metaphor to even as young as a 19-year-old. I would use that metaphor to say, it is so normal that you're experiencing this. Of course, you miss being at home. If we pretend like we're not, it's having the Jack in the Box and use that metaphor to show we don't want homesickness to pop up in the middle of a maths test or to pop up in the middle of the night. Actually, let's talk about it. It's okay. And perhaps that's my favorite phrase. It's okay, because it's such a normal experience for homesickness.
Yeah, fantastic. Next one is around parents. What are your suggestions for our parents when it comes to homesickness? Often the parents play a major role in enhancing our daughter's homesickness.
Yeah, I think that's a boundaries thing, and we've kind of touched on it a little bit throughout the webinar on, say, social media in particular. And there's a limit. There's if we cut all connection with family, that is not helpful. If we have family checking in every morning, every night, every lunch hour, that is also not helpful. So it is about finding a balance. And I wonder if a part of finding that balance is educating parents on exactly their role in homesickness and how exactly what this person has said, how they can either enhance and actually, to the detriment of the student, kind of make homesickness worse. So if parents have perhaps a bit more education and awareness, I would hope that would go a long way into them being able to put boundaries in on their own behaviour as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ola. This was great. What is one piece of advice you would give to boarding staff about homesickness?
I like that. I would, as a staff member, stop, take a breath, then make a decision on what you need to do. If we go into it thinking that every student is a carbon copy and I'm going to do XYZ every time a student comes to me with homesickness, that's not going to be helpful. So actually the biggest piece of advice is stop, take a breath. What does this student need right now? Do they need to just be listened to and validated that homesickness is normal and that's fine? Or stop, take a breath, have that reflection. Actually, yeah, they haven't been eating as much and they've said that they're struggling to sleep. And I know from their class, their day school kind of reports that class is becoming more and more difficult. I probably need to do something a bit more. So using that kind of stop, breathe model to make any decisions first rather than a carbon copy for each student.
I like to get parents to have calls before supper instead of bedtime. Do you agree?
Yes. Short answer, yes. We are, as humans, more emotionally vulnerable when we are tired. So before bed, you're going to be a lot more emotionally vulnerable. So if someone is struggling with homesickness and having those calls right before bedtime, it's likely that their sleep onset is then disturbed. So yes, I would say that if you're someone struggling with homesickness, emotional vulnerability is not what you want just before sleep.
Very good, Ola. And we don't have any other questions that have come through, so we might wrap things up there. Thank you so much again. A very, very informative webinar. We love the work that you do. Every webinar has always got so many pieces of gold in it. So thank you so much for your presentation today.
No worries. Thanks for having me again.
To everyone that joined us live today, thank you for joining the webinar. We hope you enjoyed it. If you're watching the recording and have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us here at the APSA office. We can certainly put you in contact with Wylau if you have further questions. Otherwise, thanks everyone for joining and bye for now. Have a lovely weekend.